So good morning, everyone. I'm Christy Miller-Hessed. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center. And I want to thank you for joining this session of the Climate Adaptation Training Series for grassland conservation practitioners. And again, please note that we are recording this session. And this is session 2 of a 5-part series. And for more information on the series, you can see the link that's in the chat. The topics that were selected for this training series were identified from work that was done by the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center to synthesize grassland management plans and identify broadly shared grassland management priorities across the North Central region. And in addition, we were also informed by conversations with a selection of grassland resource managers. Each session in this series is really packed full of information, and I'm afraid we might all feel a bit rushed. So apologies to our speakers and all of our participants. I know we have a lot more we want to say than we're going to have time for. But we are going to capture all of the information and the feedback, and all the presentations will be recorded so that you can review them later. And we will also produce a summary report describing the outcomes of this training series early next year, and we'll make sure to let all of you know when that report is available. Today's training session will include brief presentations by researchers who were key participants in the North Central Climate Adaptation Science Center working group that synthesized the climate and ecological science on managing grasslands in a changing climate. Following their 3 presentations, we will have a brief time for Q&A, and we request that you type any questions for the speakers into the chat at any time. You don't need to wait until that Q&A session. Following the Q&A, we'll divide into breakout groups where we will make some introductions and try to foster a sort of community of practice. And then we also want to invite you all to share your observations and experiences related to climate change impacts on grasslands. So our goal here today is not just to learn from our excellent presenters, but also to learn from each other. And so toward that goal, we hope you will participate fully in the breakout room conversations. And it's very important that we capture your knowledge and your needs so that we can help to inform the development of additional webinars, research, and tools that will be most relevant to your work and concerns. So we ask that you do participate in the meeting polls, use the chat boxes to share your thoughts, and later in the breakout rooms, please note your ideas and concerns on the Jamboard. Again, ultimately, we are hopeful that a community of practice can emerge from these sessions, and we plan to document and share contact information for all participants to help facilitate continuing discussions. If you would prefer not to have your contact information shared, please let us know by emailing Emma Custer, and her email is in the chat. So before we hear from our first presenter this morning, we want to hear from all of you. So we have a Mentimeter poll, and there is a link for that in the chat. Once you're at that site, in a couple of words, please share one thing you know or possibly recently learned in this training series about climate change related to grasslands. And I think that link will be in the chat in just a second. And so as you're thinking about this, the challenge is really to try to limit yourself to 2 words because we're going to generate a word cloud. So for example, if I recently learned that climate change will decrease snowpack, I would type simply decrease snowpack to capture the main idea. So I'll give you a minute to get to that Mentimeter site and type in your response. I'm sharing the screen as everyone shares their response, we can see a word cloud. Well, thanks very much. I'm really struck by the diversity of responses. So thanks for sharing that. And we'll have a couple other Menti polls in today's session, but I want to turn now to our presentations. So in the interest of time today, I'm not going to be giving detailed introductions to our very excellent speakers. However, you can read more about them in the email I sent this morning, and we will also paste bios into the chat. So our first speaker today is Dr. Imtiaz Rangwala, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Christy. Thanks for inviting me to participate in this, and good morning or good afternoon to everyone joining today. So my name is Imtiaz Rangwala. I'm a climate researcher at University of Colorado Boulder, traditional lands of Arapaho, Cheyenne, Ute tribes, among others. So I'm going to present on a very quick synthesis, if I could say that, of climate change projections and expected impacts on water availability and wildfire behavior in the US North Central region. This is a chapter we put together for one of the reports for the North Central CASC Grassland Synthesis Project, co-led by Christy and Heather Yoakum. Acknowledge my co-authors down there. So let's start with just briefly touching on climate characteristics in the North Central region. And as you can see, the North Central is the northern and the central Great Plains, as many would call it. So this region really has an interior continental location, and it experiences large variability across the year in terms of the climate it experiences, from cold winters to warm summers. Now, this region also allows for, really facilitates this free movement of large air masses in the region from all directions. And so it's really prone to sudden changes in weather and high winds. And related to that, this region is sensitive to large-scale atmospheric circulation processes more than other regions. So it sees this large year-to-year variability, or decade-to-decadal variability. And so, wet and dry extremes are kind of a norm in this region. I'm showing these climographs, which is really temperature and precipitation climatologies on the right for these different ecoregions we looked at in this project. But don't worry about focusing too hard on these graphics. The point I want to make is temperature is relatively similar across much of the region. The gradient is smaller than the gradient in precipitation. There's a large precipitation gradient going from the east of the domain to the west. Less of that going from south to north, so a lot more moisture in the east relative to the west. Anywhere from 50 inches to less than 10 inches in the west. One common characteristic across much of the region is much of the precipitation occurs between April and October, and with more than 50% of annual precip coming just between April and July. So if you miss precipitation during those 3-4 months, it's a big deal. And as we saw in 2017, flash drought with severe consequences, May, June, July, that missed the precip then. And in a world with a warming climate, that could be pretty consequential. So let's really get into our chapter, and where we get into some of the details of observed climate change and projected climate change. And starting with temperature, so we find that temperature across the region has increased by 1 to 2 degrees Fahrenheit in the last few decades, and that's kind of the warming signal in the region. The largest warming has occurred in winter, and primarily in parts of Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota, but more than 3 degrees Fahrenheit warming. So that's very substantial warming that happened, particularly in winter, as opposed to summer, which experiences the least amount of warming. May surprise some. And it's partly due to, I'll explain later, the changes in precipitation summer season has seen in recent decades. So parts of the Eastern Plains, as I'm pointing here, has seen little to no warming. And it's just actually in contrast to a lot of warming happening in summertime in other parts of the country. So if you look at projected changes by mid-century, and I'll show a couple of these graphics, but they're looking, much of the projections I'm showing, I was looking at mid-century, and this one is a mean of 28 climate models. What we find that, again, the mean of all models shows that temperature increase of 5 to 6 degrees warming, and that's really 5 to 6 degrees relative to pre-industrial. So that's the total warming that the region could experience by 2050. And the likelihood that we get to that mark is pretty high, and that should worry us. Winter and spring are expected to experience the largest increases, something you're actually seeing in the recent changes. So one phenomena that we expect going into the future is that the frequency and intensity of heat spells are going to go up pretty rapidly, while those of cold spells are projected to decrease. So lesser of those cold spells. However, it doesn't mean that risk of something like a frost damage could go down substantially, because you'll see that as the growing season is expanding, greening up is happening earlier, and so the frost damage may not change substantially and perhaps increase in certain circumstances. Let's look at precipitation. This is looking at observed changes, again, last 30 years relative to much of the 20th century. And what you see is that, as good news, if you can call it, precipitation has increased across much of the region. And in parts of the Eastern Plains, particularly South Dakota, changes have been in the order of 10 to 20% increases. These increases have been occurred in all seasons, and particularly the northern part of our domain, Montana, North Dakota, and South Dakota, have also seen a reduction in the period of dry intervals, so days without precipitation, and that's sometimes good news for drought-related impacts. And that's really in contrast with much of the Western U.S. and the Great Plains region. And we believe that part of these observed increasing trend in precipitation is driven by variability. It can be all climate change, and that's kind of thought. Just another look at that observed precipitation trend is just looking at weather stations across the Western U.S. And one thing that stands out on the left is just the trends for the last 5 decades. And what you see is that the northern tier of the country is actually seeing an increases in precipitation, while the southern tier is seeing decreases. And that's consistent with what the models have been telling us. But interestingly, when you just look at the dry intervals, and this one is showing the longest dry intervals. So during a year, the longest period during the year, consecutive days of no rain or precipitation. And this is really happening. Much of that happens during summer, actually. And what we find is that North Central region particularly is an anomaly here. actually seeing a reduction in that longest dry interval. The rest of the Western US may increase. Really interesting to look at, everywhere else around you is getting dry and hotter. What does it mean for you? So looking at projected changes, again, consistent with what much of it is consistent with what we've been observing, that increases in annual precipitation across much of the northern plains or north central region, particularly spring and winter. The anomaly comes with the summer precipitation, where models for the most part are showing a decreasing signal for summertime precipitation, more so in the central plains relative to the northern plains, but as much as 10% decreases. However, there's just less agreement across models for changes in precipitation in summer and fall for kind of this sign of change. And so more research is needed there. There's high confidence, though, that future storms and precipitation events will be more extreme. And especially when it comes to the warm season convective rainfall, we can expect 7 to 14% increase in the intensity of precipitation for every degree Celsius warming. Or like a rule of thumb would be a 5% increase for every 1 degree Fahrenheit warming. So overall, the risk for flooding is expected to go up. Well, let's get into where the impacts happen, and that's the big concern is with drought in the region. Warming actually increases the atmospheric thirst, and that kind of produces an evaporative stress on the land, and the losses through evaporation are expected to increase. Models show that. So that could lead to drying of the landscape. So that's where aridification is, a landscape becoming drier. However, we find that that especially the northern plains region, because of this increase in precipitation, could experience an offset in that aridification process. And the results on the right here, and I was looking at changes in the late 21st century relative to the late 20th century. And again, looking at, close to 30 odd models and getting the mean change represented here, or median change represented here. And just looking at number of dry days in topsoils and the longest period in the bottom soils. And the point that this paper made was that chronic droughts are projected for much of the central and the southern plains, but not so much for the northern plains. As you can see in the difference between the green and the brown here. However, if you look at the models carefully, you'll find that the north central region could experience these late growing season aridification, or a drying that's more than what we experienced in the past, just because much of that, because the temperature is causing evaporative losses earlier in the growing season, and so the latter season actually seeing drying, and also predicting more severe droughts despite increases of precipitation in the region that are projected. Again, this point I just made, but I just wanted to emphasize that we could experience large shifts in water availability during the year, with better springs and drier late summers and fall. And so, which could lead to this kind of both more greening and more drying in the future that is seasonally separated, and the consequence it would have for all kind of livelihood practices in the region, and including the wildfire behavior. Looking quickly at snow, snow is expected to largely decrease, so except for sometimes in winter and in certain places that are very cold because of increase in precip, you can see increase in snow, but more precipitation falling as rain rather than snow, earlier snow melt, will just cause shorter duration snow on the ground and lesser area covered with snow. Frequency of winter storms is not expected to change, but we have high confidence that more of this precipitation in the future from these storms will come in greater amounts at higher rates, which could also mean stronger blizzards. There's less confidence actually in how the maximum wind speeds associated with storms will change. Looking at stream flow, what we've found that in recent times, and this is just looking at the Missouri Basin, that we have seen decreases in the headwaters region of the Missouri Basin and in the southern parts of the Missouri Basin in terms of annual stream flow trends. However, in much of the eastern and the central part of the basin, we have seen increases. So there are these two trends emerging. Projections show that there will be modest increase in annual stream flow, but there'll maybe decreases seasonally, and particularly in late fall, late summer and fall period. But more importantly, the finding shows that extreme events and large interannual variability will have a greater influence on water availability in the region than mean changes in the climate. Groundwater, this was a little bit of surprise when I was researching on this for this chapter, that groundwater recharge is expected to increase in the northern high plains because of increases in winter and spring precipitation, more of this precip falling as rain rather than snow, and increases in extreme precipitation events. So that's what you see here. Anything in blue and green is showing increases in precipitation. However, you see that the degree of model agreement is on the low side for things. Oh, and I have 2 more slides here, Christy, so I'll wrap it up soon. So wetlands, ponds, and lakes, and just wanted to cover that piece a little bit, but particularly in the northern part of the domain, increase in large precipitation events in the last 30 years have actually seen high level of soil moisture, increased runoff by as much as 400% into these wetlands and ponds and lakes. And these changes have actually led to more frequent, intense, and destructive flooding events. Projections on the side of the ponds in the region, the prairie potholes in particular, show that the warming and changes in precipitation expected to decrease the number of ponded wetlands, but not influence the distribution so much. But the extreme events in the future, events in the future, are expected to keep water in these systems. However, when you experience these severe intermittent drought, that could compromise their water quality. And finally, on wildfire, our conclusions were that wildfire frequency and size have been increasing and projected to increase in the future. And however, models show a large range for these grassland ecosystems because of the combination of different wet and dry conditions that each model experiences. There is some consensus on that the prescribed fire windows are expected to decrease and are already decreasing. Grazing as a process could alter fire characteristics and reduce the risk of wildfire. And fuel treatments may become less effective as more extreme weather conditions emerge in the region. So with that, I'll hand it back to Christy. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Imtiaz, for sharing all that information so quickly for us. I saw a bunch of questions, and we'll have a little bit of Q&A after we hear from all of our presenters. David, I think you're up next. So this is Dr. David Wood, who's an ecologist and conservation biologist, and we'll put some bio information in the chat. And if you want to go ahead and take it away.
All right, thanks, Christy. Let me click on all the right buttons.
Looks good.
Got it. All right, thank you. I just gotta move this screen. All right, well, thanks everybody. Thanks for the intro, Christy. Yeah, so I'm David Wood. I'm from ecologist with the USGS Northern Rocky Mountain Science Center, but sit in Billings, Montana, and primarily work in the Northwestern Great Plains. And so today, going to kind of take that next step and talk about phenology and climate change. So Imtaz did a great start there about what some of the changes are that are happening or projected to happen. And then going to talk today primarily about vegetation, the consequences and the changes in timing of vegetation, but also hit on other species and taxa as well out there. And so what I hope to do today is talk about what's happening with the timing of these seasonal events, what some of those drivers are, how this leads to mismatches, and then what some of the consequences are of those changes. So to dive into this, I saw on the word cloud earlier that there's a handful of folks that talked about phenology already, but just to make sure we're on the same page. So phenology, I like this definition here, that it's the study of recurring life cycle events that are initiated and driven by environmental factors. Key to understand here is that there's feedbacks with the atmosphere and the biosphere for phenology and downstream consequences. So as phenology changes, that has consequences for energy partitioning and may be a positive or in some cases a negative feedback with climate change, as well as then the consequences back down into the to other members of the ecosystem. When we think about studying phenology, there's a lot of different scales and a lot of different techniques. Kind of one of the standard ways a lot of people think about this is down here on the bottom here, where we're going to look at individual plants or individual organisms. And in this case, we're thinking about events like bud burst or first flowering, or when you get that change in leaf color in the senescence at the end of into the fall, for example. If we switch here, a lot of studies look at land surface phenology, and they'll do this through remote sensing. In this case, we're going to look at those changes in colors. And so when we do that, we have a surrogate here. For example, we have a surrogate, whether that's NDVI or a series of other vegetation indices. And if we measure this over the course of the growing season or the course of the year, we can then fit a curve to this and identify some different events. And so it's a bit harder with remote sensing. There are some instances where you pick up sort of those like flowering or other types of phenological events. But in this case, we're looking at something like inflection points within the curve where we can say the season has started growing. Where's that peak? I don't know if you can see my cursor on here, but where's that peak? And that's going to be sort of that high point of productivity, or that when we get back down to this baseline value where we get to the end of the season. And then if we integrate under the curve between that start and end of the season, we can get a surrogate for season-long productivity. And so there's a bunch of different measures that we can get from here. And then of course, if you measure that through space or time, we can then compare and say, how are these growing curves? And then the events that happen along these growing curves shifting in time or space as well. So to dive in, what's happening in grassland phenology, this is a kind of a global study, but is a good position to start with. So these are changes highlighting where there's significant changes over the last several decades in start and end of season. As you get to these blue colors to the left here, we're seeing earlier events, and these yellow and red colors are later events. So in the grasslands of the central United States, the start of the season is getting earlier, but we don't see sort of a pattern, anything showing up significant in the northern Great Plains. A bit of a salt and pepper, sort of both earlier and later in the southern plains. For end of season, you start seeing that's becoming later in the northwestern plains. A little bit of evidence in some parts of the central plains, and again that salt and pepper pattern of both some areas earlier and later. For the length of the season then, you see predominantly that growing season is extending, although because of that mismatch, you can see some areas here as you get farther south, things are just both directions. And so to look at that in a bit, zoom into the Western US, you can see there's just a lot of heterogeneity in what's going on. So again, blue colors are events that are happening earlier. for start of season. Red are those events that are happening later. And so in a lot of areas, we see a little bit of an earlier start of spring here, but because there's so much mixing, when you take that higher scale look, there wasn't too much that was significant. And so to switch taxa here a little bit, this is a study that looked at migratory bird species and said, okay, so where's that mean first arrival date? And that's that FAD between 1910 and 1949 for these. And then we're going to look at that again from 2000 to 2012. And you can see that predominantly when you plot these mid-century to start of this century dates, they fall below this 1-to-1 line. So we see that migratory grassland bird species are arriving earlier in the northern Great Plains predominantly, some pretty much the same, and then there's a change in magnitude of those as well. As we look across taxa as well, this is another great study I like to just show, just to get, there's differences in responses between taxa. And so as you get below this 0 line, these are spring events that are happening across these different taxa earlier. For those few bars that are above the line, there are some taxa or species where those spring events are actually happening later in the year as well. And so the sort of the two things to note: one, there are spring events that are happening later for several different reasons and drivers that I'll try to touch on a little bit here later. And then that the magnitude of these spring events are differing between different groups and even within groups. So amphibians, lots of very big movement, spring events happening quite a bit earlier versus maybe in vegetation where those events are maybe not quite so long. Lots of variation within birds and of course across all of these taxa. So the consequences here, if you're getting mismatches in timing, can be disruptions both to management or to the ecosystem. Not too much time to dive into sort of all these different types of interactions here, but you can see if herbivores are showing up and not hitting sort of that peak green period a lot of times, that has consequences down into the soils for available soil nitrogen. If birds aren't showing up and reducing caterpillars as defoliators, that decreases vegetation biomass. So the plant may have to allocate more resources towards recovering that. And that has consequences on the opposite way. Maybe we see increased soil nitrogen. And of course, there's other examples here of salmon grizzly mismatches and plant pollinator mismatches that will lead to differences in production or sequestration of that ecosystem. And then also has consequences for other species within the ecosystem, perhaps decreases in fecundity. They might end up in having to encounter resource switching if they're not matching, they're not showing up at the time when their resources are at their peak or most available. All right, so I'm just going to dive into my work here quickly a little bit, since I know we don't have a ton of time, mainly just to illustrate, because most of my work hones in on what the different drivers are of these phenological events, and understanding that the responses to drivers may differ between vegetation types and regions. And so part of the complexity or part of the reason that we're getting these mismatches is that there's going to be differences in climate changes. MTS sort of showed, so like a migratory species that triggered what might trigger to start its migratory movement may be different than where it's than the condition where you're ending up. And then the other thing to talk about here is that there's multi-year legacy drivers that will show up in some of these broader measures of phenology. So to dive into this a bit, the other thing, as I kind of just talked about here, is there's differences in scale. So depending on what your question is, there's going to be differences in phenological patterns as you look across Montana between, just between the west and the east, right? Of how the forested regions are changing versus the grassland regions, and then how you'll get that heterogeneity kind of in these mid scales, and then how individual taxa are going to respond. Are deep-rooted shrubs going to respond differently than perennial plants and annual forbs into those differences and those trends in climate and that variability in climate. So real quickly here, just to highlight some of those differences between two phenological measures of productivity. So remember, peak productivity, that highest point you get to within a growing season, versus season-long productivity, how much biomass or above ground productivity do you have throughout a given year. We see that predominantly in this comparison of annual precipitation, mean annual temperature, and just trend, just something else that's going on, is this red, that's year variable. For example, you see that predominantly most of the peak productivity is blue. So drivers there predominantly going to be annual precipitation. But you can see down in Yellowstone, the recovery from the fires, there's a strong time trend in there that's not annual precipitation or mean annual temperature. And as you see changes in fallow practices, for example, in this part of the Northwestern Plains, as there's less and less ground left fallow, you actually see more and more green out there, right? And so versus any changes in climate, there are management changes or recovery from disturbance that also might be changing the phenology or productivity of a particular area. When we switch to season-long productivity, you see a lot more greens coming into here. And so these are going to be, so it's going to be the combination in a lot of parts of the Northwestern Plains, for example, between precipitation and temperature, that's going to be giving you that season-long precipitation. Of course, that was a pretty simple model, so we can complicate these models more when we're looking at land surface phenology. Within a remote sensing pixel, we can start looking at shorter and periods, seasonal weather, as well as looking back into time on weather. We can start including soils and other location information in our models, and we can also include the differences in land cover within a pixel. So understand what that makeup, for example, of grassland versus deciduous forest versus evergreen forest versus agriculture are within a given remote sensing pixel to help us in predicting what those phenological responses are going to be. And so not to dive too much into the results of those, but just to highlight a couple of things that we've been finding is that, we understand that sort of what spring temperature is going to be an important driver, for example, on when the start of the season is, but there are these legacy effects, both from prior seasons and very far, or 3 to 4 years into the past, that are also driving these changes in phenology. And so if the past year is warmer or drier, we can lead to earlier springs, as well as if that past fall, for example, is a critical period for grasses, that can lead to a legacy effect with decreased season-long productivity in the next growing season. If we're in a wet period, we can see that any given amount of precipitation, we find that in grasslands, a given amount of precipitation increases the productivity. So a set amount as you're coming 400 millimeters, or sorry, that's a lot, 200 millimeters of precipitation in a year will lead to more above ground biomass in as you're coming out of a wet period than if you're coming out of a drought. And of course, we find that those soils and land cover are going to be important as well. Not to dive into this too much, but within that community that you're measuring, there's going to be shifts of annuals versus perennials depending on what's happening. There's going to be recovery from drought. There's going to be root versus shoot ratio types of things. And also, as we've talked about today, that timing of moisture can be very important about which species may be dominant or which species may be more successful within that vegetation community. All right, so just to dive in as a quick example here of what some small scale heterogeneity can be. We've done some work where we'll fly a UAV multiple times across the growing season and can measure at a particular site. And what we find here is that we can find very different and diverse phenological curves, these growing season curves throughout the year. And that enables us to map across, in this case, like 300 by 300 meter areas, what some of those differences and where those differences fall. And so as a quick example here, these deeper green colors, these are both denser and grasses that are growing, have longer growing seasons, versus when you get into these other areas of these lighter greens, these are going to be grasses, similar species or the same species, but they're shorter more flashier growing seasons. And then the yellows are actually sagebrush, which are, being green as sagebrush can be, throughout the growing season for longer. And it turns out that, this area where this green is actually a draw, whether this is going to have higher snow or be able to maintain more moisture, or is a north aspect and just isn't getting sort of the solar intensity. Oh, sorry, Christy, I'm going way over here, but I'll wrap up here quickly. There's going to be heterogeneity within this, even at small scales within this landscape. So a species that's choosing sort of where to actually go and utilize it here. And if you're looking at consequences, it's going to be understanding sort of those differences between scales. And so just to wrap that up, we found out or talked a bit about here that those events, those phenological events, were becoming earlier, later, or staying the same. This is leading to mismatch, and the differences in drivers is sort of where those differences in direction and magnitude are coming from. And so when thinking about this and these predictions of climate change, accounting for all of these various drivers is, certainly what's going to complicate things and understanding how processes may change. And so this was one small part of the North Central CAST that work that we've been doing for that synthesis project. And so these phenological indicators are one key puzzle piece that is coming in here. And as we think about this, understanding that being able to dive into the details of these mismatches, we can understand how these affect ecosystems or human communities. And so that's probably a good spot to end there. Thanks, Kristen.
Thanks very much, David. It's very interesting. Sorry to rush you there at the end. But
oh, no problem. I just got my voice back after 3 days, so I'm happy to talk, but I'll stop.
Okay. So if anyone has questions for David, please go ahead and put those in the chat, and I'll turn it over now to Tony Clem, and there's a bio for Tony in the chat as well. So go ahead and take it away, Tony.
Thanks, Christy. Okay, what did we do earlier? I share my screen first, and then I'm gonna start my presentation. Just as a heads up, when I start my presentation in presentation mode, I'm not going to see anything of what's going on in Zoom. So I'm not going to see any questions or anyone's faces. So Christy, if you give me a nudge, how much time do I have? Just so
about 12 minutes, and I'll interrupt you and give you a 2-minute warning if that sounds okay.
Okay, please interrupt because I'm not going to see anyone here. Okay, title slide is showing up?
It looks good, yeah. It looks
okay,
great.
Awesome. So thanks for inviting me. I'm Tony Clem. I am currently in Berlin, Germany. I used to be a postdoc with the Northern Plains Climate Hub in Fort Collins. And what I'm talking about today is a chapter from the Grasslands synthesis report that Christy put together that I wrote with Jeff Martin. And I wish he was here because he is much more the brain to the essence of this chapter. I have a background in most of this, but if you have any in-depth questions, please send them to Jeff. He will be very happy to receive all of your emails. I'll have the email address on the last slide. So climate change is affecting the Northern Plains grasslands, as we just heard from Imtiaz and David. The question that we were asking was, how will this affect grazing livestock, both physiologically, health-wise, how will it affect forage? And then I'm also going to dive into the impacts on ranching and some social science here, but just really briefly at the end. So just to repeat what Imtiaz said earlier, the temperature in the Northern Plains currently, or from 1981 to 2010, the average was 6.7 degrees Celsius. Sorry, I'm gonna switch back and forth between Celsius and Fahrenheit. I just realized that. Apologies for that. But if we look at the projections for the Northern Plains, and I'm trying to find my, trying to find my mouse here. Christy, do I have a?
What's the question? You looking for a mouse?
I'm not gonna, okay, well, I guess my mouse isn't showing up on the screen. But if we look at the Northern Plains rectangle there at the top left, historically, the average temperature was 6.7 degrees. For moderate warming by the end of the century, we expect about an increase of 3 degrees Celsius, and with high warming, about 5.3 degrees Celsius. That's really abstract, but what it comes down to is that temperature-wise, average annual temperature-wise, the Northern Plains will be closer, by the end of the century, it will be closer to the Central Plains of today, and then as I said, the Central Plains at the end of the century will be about the Southern Plains of today. Of course, the problem is that rainfall doesn't match this change, and so in the long run, we'll actually see a drying of the Northern Plains because it will, yes, it will get wetter, but the increase in temperature will outpace the increase in precip. So there'll be more evaporation. As MTS said at the beginning, there'll be more evaporation because there's a greater increase in temperature. In terms of variability, year-to-year variability, we calculated that for the Northern Plains. With temperature, it doesn't actually make that big of a difference, both for moderate warming, so RCP 4.5, if you're into climate and weather, and high warming RCP 8.5. The variability year to year is about the same, about 1 degree Celsius average change from year to year, average variability. But when we look at rainfall, at precipitation, the variability increases. So the average difference from one year to the next changes from 113 millimeters historically to 133, 146 for moderate and high warming. So that means we get greater variability in year-to-year rainfall, and also that's not really new. But the tricky thing is, as we go in the future and it gets warmer and the variability increases, we get more years where it's warmer but also drier. So the magnitude of droughts and wet, dry and wet years will increase because the variability in rainfall increases. That just as kind of a climate primer here. And in terms of land cover and forage, there's a lot of bars here, there's a lot of graphs, but what's important here is to follow the thick green bars. Those are the changes that we projected for net primary productivity of grasslands. So it's a measure of biomass production in grasslands, and per square meter, so per fixed unit, it doesn't change that much, but we see an overall change. That was in the top left. In the bottom left, we see that even though grasslands stay as productive as they were, the total grassland coverage goes down, and the coverage, or the area that's occupied by non-grasslands, so woodlands, anything from shrubs to forests, will increase. So we have a decrease in overall grassland area from today, or at the end of the century compared to today. So that means the overall net primary productivity of grasslands goes down as well. That's in the top right. And also extreme forage years, because of this increase in fluctuation in climate from year to year, also increases. So we calculated that historically about 4 years per decade, forage production was greater when was, let me get this right, was more than 25% different from the decadal average. And in the future, that number goes more to 5.5 years and up to almost 7 years at the end of the century for high warming. So we see more extreme years in terms of forage, both surplus forage and deficit forage, but more extreme years and fewer quote unquote normal years. That's kind of the takeaway here for managers, for ranchers, because that's going to be more difficult for them to manage, we think. Now, the effects on grazers, the effects of climate change on grazers is something that Jeff studied during his PhD at Texas A&M. And the general rule is the colder it is, the greater an animal, the larger the body size of an animal. It's called Berkman's rule, and it works for most megafauna animals. So anything that can live across a large area, like bison, deer, bear, not endemic area and endemic species that only exists in very small areas. But Berkman's rule basically says that megafauna animals are larger, closer to the poles, and smaller, closer to the equator. Of course, the latitude doesn't control that. It's the temperature that is the driving force. The warmer it is, the more an animal has to do with thermal regulation, has to use energy to regulate their own body temperature. And that's more difficult for large animals than for small animals. So a cow, for example, has greater trouble, or for them, it's a bigger problem than for a goat or a sheep, for example. But animals use parts of the nutrition or body fat for body cooling rather than muscle growth. So that means animals won't grow as much when it's warmer. That's why bison, for example, in Texas are smaller. Not everything is bigger in Texas, I guess. So yeah, responsible for the latitudinal difference in body size, but thermoregulation is also responsible for the historic change in body size. And Jeff did two studies. One that I want to point out here, he measured the size of bison, or he went into the archive at Wind Cave National Park. I think that's point number 7, 8, or 9 on the map on the left in southwestern South Dakota. And through measurements of a small bone, they found that over the course of 50 years, bison changed their body size or decreased body size by 11% for females and 23% for males, only over the course of 50 years. That's a massive change. And I should say on the bottom left there, it looks like temperature was constant over that time period, but it really increased by about 1 degree Celsius. So it got warmer, and bison adjusted to this new climate by becoming smaller.
Tony, sorry to interrupt. 2-minute warning here.
Oh, shoot. Okay. Projected forwards with increased temperature by about 4 degrees, projected that female and male further decreased their body size by about 24 and 16%. And I just want to point out here that with cattle, if you're a cattle rancher or have to do with cattle, the trajectory with cattle is in the exact opposite direction, right? Cattle are bred to be larger than smaller, so that's a sort of double whammy because they're even less suitable for warmer climates. Okay, this is just to summarize. We got climate change is getting warmer, body size is getting smaller from top to bottom, and it's because of more heat stress and because of less nutritious forage. I also want to point out some animal health, an animal health aspect. It's called winter slump. Or maybe I'll have to skip that. But on the right, one thing to point out is that certain parasites that bison are relatively immune now. They're Arctic Aphene, Ostertagia, and Couperia. I'm sure I'm butchering this. They're more Arctic Aphene And because of climate change, they're pushed further north, and Hemoncus, a different type of helminth, a different type of parasite, is coming in from the tropics. They feast on the blood cells of bison, which causes immune stress and reduces oxygen transport within the animal. And obviously that's bad for their health. So increased health risks and longer risk periods because those animals, those parasites live longer.
Final thoughts, please. Sorry.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think I'm gonna have to skip this. But I just wanna point out at the end, if you're interested, here's the literature that I used. You can scan the QR code with your phone to get to all the resources, and you can email us if you have any questions. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Tony. Sorry to rush you through.
No, thanks a lot. Sorry.
If anyone has questions, again, please put those in the chat, and Sean's going to facilitate a brief Q&A session in just a moment. But before we do that, I'd like you all to help answer a question so I can set out breakout rooms according to interest. So we know that all of the information presented by our three speakers is really important for managing grasslands in a changing climate, and all of these presentations interconnect in really interesting and complex ways. However, we also recognize that you all may have particular questions or issues that are of more pressing or higher importance to your grassland management work right now. So we're going to do a Menti poll to help inform our breakout room topics. So a link will be put in the chat. It's that same Menti link that we used before. And if you could please indicate which topic you'd be most interested in discussing during a breakout session this morning, that will help me to set up breakout rooms appropriately. So appreciate your input on that.
Well, hi, everyone. This is Sean Finn with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Science Applications Program. And while Christy is sorting through the Menti and getting our breakout room set up, we did have a couple of questions in the chat box, and I want to invite everyone to continue to ask questions here for any of our speakers. So I'll quickly thank MTAS, David, and Tony for presenting to us. And I'll just read the questions that we have so far, and then we can see if we can elaborate on them a little bit. But the first question is for MTAS, and the question is, MTAS, do you see a fundamental difference between moderate and high warming, that is RCP 4.5 versus 8.5? Or is high warming just a stronger change in temperature, precipitation, and variability?
Thanks, Sean. So basically, there's no fundamental difference when you look at these two RCPs, which are these emission scenarios. One is kind of intermediate, and one is this high emission scenario by mid-century. But by late century, the warming is twice as much in 8.5 as is in 4.5. So 8.5 is twice warmer, but we also increasingly, the scientific community is talking about likelihoods of these scenarios, and the RCP 4.5 is more close to where the trajectory is going, and 8.5 is considered as a very unlikely scenario, although it's used in an extreme case. So when I said like 5 to 6 degrees warming, Fahrenheit warming by mid-century, the RCPs don't matter much. The 5 was for 4.5, 6 was for 8.5 mean. They don't matter a whole lot, the difference between that. But the likelihood that we can reach that is pretty high, just based on the current trajectories in our emissions.
Great, thank you, MTS. I think that's a source of confusion for a lot of people, so appreciate you clearing that up a little bit. I know it's all still projections, but any advice and guidance we can get is great, so thank you. The next question is for David Wood. David, do you think you mentioned local heterogeneity within the response, phenological response of plant communities, and the question is do you think that local heterogeneity may provide local climate refugia allowing individuals to find suitable niches locally?
Yeah, it's kind of broad. I think there's certainly opportunities. I've thought about this a little bit from the standpoint of like ungulates surfing the green wave, and that if there is some heterogeneity, that there still may be areas on the landscape where that do have sort of the targeted specific vegetation they're looking for in the spring as they're moving. So to me, it's sort of a question of like, do we have the capabilities of measuring phenological differences at the scales that are important for what we're trying to project changes to? And so that's kind of the matching up from scales, but certainly I do think there's some opportunity in those local refugia to provide these buffers and provide sort of those areas. Just reminds me of, like a lot of the other work where we can do management for like late summer brood rearing habitat for sage grouse, where if we can keep those areas that do stay greener longer on the landscape, there are consequences and potential other influences out there, but that there is some opportunity there, certainly from adaptation option.
I know there are other questions in the chat, and so I had reached out to our speakers earlier anticipating a time crunch, and we'll circle up with them and see if we can get some answers and share those over email. I did want to go ahead and open breakout rooms at this time. And so based on the poll, we'll have 2 rooms on the life cycle timing of plants. And so as I open that, you'll see that one of them is labeled life cycle January to June. That has to do with your birthday. So to try to get everyone evenly distributed, if your birthday month is between January and June, please choose that first room for life cycle if that's your interest. And if your birthday is between July and December, please choose that second room with Mary. And you can see facilitators, I've assigned you each to a room. You can go ahead and move into those, and I will link you with your Jamboards. And speakers, please also feel free to join a room.
Christy, it says here that there's a grazing room with just one person. Is that open or not? Oh, you're muted.
Yes, you can go ahead and join that one. That'd be great, Tony. I'm sure folks have questions. For those of you still in this main room, let me know if you need help moving into one of the breakout rooms. I'd be glad to help shift you into one of those. Sure. Kim, which room, if you can just unmute or chat and let me know which room you were wanting to join, I can move you there.
I wanted to go to the grazing. Thank you. My apologies for being so dense.
No worries. I'll move you there here in just a second.
Thank you.
Yep, thanks for letting me know. Hello, welcome. All right. Oh, Welcome back. Give just a minute for everyone to get back to this main room, and then just a couple thoughts before we adjourn for today. All right, welcome back, everyone. I trust you've all had interesting discussions in your breakout rooms. I want to again thank our speakers for sharing all of that really important information in a very interesting way. And also want to thank all of you for participating in the breakout room discussions. The Jamboards will remain active, so if anything else occurs to you throughout the day, please feel free to add additional thoughts. I know we're right at the end of the time we said we would stick to, but I just want to share that we do have another 2 webinars scheduled. So I'm going to paste the link for registering. Oh, Elise, thank you. Elise has the link for that in the chat. So the next webinar will be July 20 at 2 p.m. Central Time. And the topic for that one is Grasslands, Climate and Land Cover Change. And the webinar will include presentations about woody vegetation encroachment, transformational drought, and water availability. And then we also have a webinar scheduled for August 31st at 1 p.m. Central. And the topic for that one is Grasslands, Climate and Trust Species. And this one will use grassland birds as a case study to discuss new research on how climate change impacts grassland birds, from range shifts to demographic consequences. So we hope you'll join us for those 2 sessions as well. And again, thank you so much for your time today.